Hello everybody, welcome back to Witchfix. Today we're looking at a non-fiction title which I've actually been wanting to read for a while, and it's just sat on my shelf, and every time I think, oh, I want to read a non-fiction book, I pick it up and then go, no, now is not the time for you. But it was the time recently, so I'm going to review The Goddess is in the Details, A Wisdom for the Everyday Witch by Deborah Blake, and the back cover says the following. From the hearth to the altar, make magic in every moment. Being a witch isn't limited to casting a spell under the full moon or consecrating a ritual circle. Whether you're calling the goddess or doing the dishes, your wonderfully witchy ways are woven into everything you do. With her signature down-to-earth wisdom and warmth, Deborah Blake takes you into the heart of what it means to be a witch all day, every day, filled to the brim with practical suggestions, spells, and helpful advice. This essential book brings to light all facets of modern witch's life. So I basically just picked this up because I was interested in sort of magical lifestyle books. I've got some about like magical home to look at, but this one was at the top of my list. And I have to say, sort of summing up review time, that it was a pretty good book. I don't rate it as highly as The Circle Within by Diane Sylvan, which is a book that this book recommends that you go and read. But I do think that it is perhaps a little bit more down to earth, less concerned with, I would say, the more spiritual and religious side, and more to do with just living as a witch. So it talks a bit about relationships, about raising children, about when and how to come out of the room closet, about how to be pagan at work, how to embody these ideals, like your own personal code of ethics, and represent witches in the wider world. So if you're interested in something like that, a very sort of practical, down-to-earth guide, then look no further, because this is the one for you. So one of the biggest issues with the book, and I think this is probably my only major issue with it, and this is an issue with a lot of books, so it isn't necessarily negative against this book, but mainly against like kind of this genre of book. What I'm saying is, like, don't just not read this book because it does this thing that a lot of other people do. But it conflates Wicca and witchcraft like nobody's effing business. And I found that surprising because it actually goes to the trouble of kind of defining what it means by witches and Wiccans and pagans in like the first section. So you start off on page 3, and it says a note on names, and it talks about how Wicca, witch and pagan are different terms, and I guess broadly speaking gets most of it right, that there's kind of this umbrella term of pagan, and then there is witchcraft the practice, and there is Wicca the religion. And yet you get to page 11, so you know, not even sort of 10 pages later, and it says, whether or not they call themselves Wiccans, most witches follow the rule known as the Wiccan Rede. 8 words the Wiccan Rede fulfill, and it harm none, do what you will. So that's wrong already, right off the bat. And it kind of annoyed me because I had such high hopes, because it had taken the time to look at these different terms and to say, you know, what does this mean? And then it goes straight into basically all witches are Wiccan. And then I had to look at like when the book was published to see if, you know, like when it was coming from, and it says that this is the 10th printing, but it was apparently first copyrighted in 2009. So I think that that's like recent enough to not be falling into this sort of 90s era of like books where you can kind of forgive it for doing that, where predominantly the public face of witchcraft was Wicca. So that did annoy me slightly, but thankfully you can overlook that sort of thing, broadly speaking, once you get past chapter 2, because chapter 2 is basically all about like the values and ethics of witchcraft, but for most of it, it is just something that would apply to all kinds of witchcraft. It's very generic, so don't let that put you off if you get that far. So she also goes on to talk about the law of threefold return, which she says that there is debate about and that not everyone believes in. So it's like, so she's grasped that, but then she thinks about the heart. Anyway, doesn't matter, we'll move on. But then we get to personal responsibility, free will, words having power, and I think those are more generic concepts that we can all agree with. If you work any kind of spell work, you know that words have power, and choosing the right words mean something. And this is basically taking that into your mundane life and saying, well, if you say you're going to do something, you should do it because you've promised. Your words have power. You shouldn't go around talking bad about people because your words have power, and if you go around being a negative person, talking down about people, it'll come back on you, which is fairly accurate. So that sort of attitude, like ethics and taking it out into your personal life. Magic is real. We are part of nature. The divine is in everything, including us. Now, whether you think that that's a goddess or a god, or just like the spirit of magic, or just some sort of magical force, I think we can all agree that we are connected to it and not separate to nature. Then we get into chapter 3, the powers of words and belief. And this is also basically about positive change, affirmations, that sort of thing. And I guess I can kind of agree with that, although I'm not really into affirmations and things that much. But it again goes into that route of like walking your talk and making sure that what you're saying is commensurate with your own beliefs. Then we have part 2, the inner witch. We start talking about conscious living, integrating your spiritual beliefs into your everyday life, which is kind of good. And what I liked about this is that it had these little something to think about moments at the end of each chapter, which weren't exercises per se, but they were just sort of thought experiments. So for example, on page 31, it says something to think about. Spend some time considering what aspects of your belief as a witch you wish to bring further into your mundane life, and what parts of your life most need a magical boost. If you want, you can write a list so that you have a clear idea of what goals to focus on as you read the rest of this book. And what it doesn't say is, now that we've agreed that affirmations work, write one. Because that kind of relies on you taking the previous chapter as gospel, which has been a kind of pet peeve of mine with other books. But it just says, spend some time considering what aspects of your belief is a witch. So it's leaving those beliefs entirely up to you. It doesn't say refer back to the ones that we've just covered in the chapter. What do you believe? And how can you apply that to your mundane life? And is there a specific area where you'd like to make it more magical? So I like those. They were very general and, again, generic, but that's not a bad thing. It just means that it can apply to everybody. Now, at various points in sort of the opening 30 pages, she makes these little jokes about how we'll say we don't want another brownie, but we know that we do, and, like, we know the words have power and we need to affirm them and say things like, oh no, I don't want that brownie. And then we get into chapter 4, the healthy witch. And to be honest, I felt like this was a little bit of, it was just kind of that self-deprecating, oh no, I really shouldn't because I'm a lady and I can't have cake type feeling, which I don't really agree with, and it kind of turned me off. It just felt like too peppy and positive and a little bit annoying. Like, this would be the person who'd come up to you at work and be like, oh, you're going to eat that second biscuit. And it's like, yes, I fucking well am. But that was just a sort of a feeling I got from chapter 4. It did thankfully dissipate, but we learn about like being healthy and having like a healthy attitude and a healthy approach. And it basically also talks about not just taking painkillers, but looking at the root cause of the problem and using both Western and complementary medicine. So that's good. But then it also started to talk about like energy healing and Reiki and things that, again, weren't really my bag. So I just kind of skipped over it. But the introduction to the book just says to read which bits of it you feel like apply to you. So there isn't like this sense of you've got to read every single word that I have written because otherwise you will not have completed the full course. Not that I'm still bitter about that at all. So there we go. Then we get into mindful eating, which again is just like, there's some discussion of like vegetarianism, veganism, things like that. It's only a couple of pages, this section. One of my other sort of criticisms of the book would be that it kind of raises these important issues like dealing with prejudice, and then it only gives them like a page and a half, and I feel like we gave some other things at the beginning of the book a lot more talking about in depth, like the weight of words, and then didn't necessarily tackle more important things like having to deal with prejudice in the workplace with the same amount of dedication and pagination. So that was another kind of wobble that I had. Then we have chapter 6, dealing with crisis, how does being a witch help when things go wrong? And it talks about faith and support, perspective, our relationship with nature. I think these are valuable things that we can learn. A lot of it is just common sense. Like, if you believe in the natural cycle of things, you know that death is a part of that, and that it isn't this sort of horrible thing being visited on you because you're a sinner that you deserve. It's just part of nature. So things like that. And there's also a spell, quite a nice spell on 65 to adjust to change, which I thought was quite helpful. And another one on 66, a spell to ease life's path. Then we have part 3, the outer witch. This is all about your environment, your home, how to hide or display certain things depending on, you know, who you're sharing your environment with, what altars are for, sharing your space with non-pagans and that sort of thing. Then spiritual cleansing and house cleansing. So sort of a lot of topics covered in that section. And then we get into part 4, which was all about sex and the single witch. And what I did like about this was that it really broke down consent and personal responsibility and harm none. And even if you don't apply, you know, harm none to your magical practice, I think it's a good rule to apply to relationships, because you don't want to be hurting your romantic partner, or, you know, their romantic partner if you're part of cheating, you know, emotionally or anything. And it just sort of talks about that in a way that's very easy to break down and understand. So I quite like that chapter. I think that'd be a good one to flag up for sort of teenage readers. Skipping ahead a little bit to chapter 14, interacting with others at work, at play, prejudice and tolerance. So we've got sort of 6 pages on that, including the something to think about, something to try section and the introduction. And it talks about not having sort of prejudice towards Christians, towards other faiths, because obviously that's a negative from you. Then you don't want to be part of this cycle of prejudice and bigotry, and that's fine. But there isn't a huge amount of practical advice on how to deal with this sort of prejudice and bullying. You know, resources for sort of free legal help. I think that would have been very useful, but we don't have that, which was a slight disappointment. Then we talk about how to come out of the broom closet, how and when, that sort of thing, and representing pagans, like your sort of responsibility to the community in how you conduct yourself publicly, because like it or not, if you're part of a community, people are going to judge that community based on you. Then we have a little bit of talk about covens. This section I kind of skipped over because it wasn't particularly groundbreaking. It was something I'd seen in other books. Obviously, if you hadn't read it in other books, I think this would be quite useful to you, but it was sort of more of the same. And a little bit of talk about incorporating daily and monthly and yearly rituals into your life. This was something that I really wanted to talk about from chapter 19 in part 5, which is all about sort of your practice. So we go through all of the Sabbats and things like that. I feel like there must be an unwritten law somewhere that you have to include a breakdown of the Sabbats in every book you write about Wicca or witchcraft or paganism, because I've read it in so many books and I feel like it's a section we don't necessarily need repeating. But again, it's useful information, and I'm aware that not everyone is going to buy like 60 of the same type of books, because, you know, they're just not going to. They're sensible people. But what I found interesting was on page 186, 187, she talks about establishing your own kind of festivals based on like the more mundane calendar, which is something that I've thought about previously. Her breakdown of it is very American centric, so basically all American holidays. So that's less useful for, I guess, an English person, but we do share some of them, like Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day, New Year's Eve, that type thing. So I found that quite good. I'm just going to read 1 or 2 just so you get the general idea. So for Martin Luther King Day, it says, take a few moments to thank the gods that we live in a time when witches are reasonably free to live as we please, and send out a prayer for all those around the globe who still deal with oppression and prejudice. So again, kind of taking the meaning of that holiday and putting a magical spin on it. I did find the St. Patrick's Day one quite funny. Just the mental image of someone actually doing this and not be like absolutely busting along laughing. I couldn't imagine it. It says that all you need for this ritual for St. Patrick's Day is a sheet, a cloak, or any large piece of cloth. Cast a circle and listen to some snake charming music for a while. Think about shedding your own skin and reinventing yourself with a new exterior, maybe one that is stronger or more beautiful or more creative. Let the music carry you into an altered state of mind, then get down on the floor and slither yourself under the sheet. Stay there until you feel yourself changing, then slither out the other side and back into your life. I found that hysterical. I actually had to take a minute. It's just this idea of someone listening to some like snake charming music and wiggling under a sheet and then just waiting under there. I feel like if I went through any change, it would be having a serious look about what I was doing with my life as a nearly 30-year-old woman wiggling around under a sheet on the floor. So I had to have a laugh at that section. I'm not trying to take the piss or anything. I'm sure this is a great idea for a ritual. St. Patrick's Day obviously being associated with St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland, and there's the yearly like memes about how those snakes are actually pagans and we should be annoyed and feel very oppressed by this. I get where like the symbolism of the snake and that is coming from, but it is just quite a funny mental image. Let's just leave it at that. There are some really nice things to do, like for Mother's Day, Earth Day, which was one I'd not previously thought of, Father's Day again, and then we sort of go into like Labour Day, Independence Day. Columbus Day was somewhere I got caught up for an entirely different reason than the wiggly snake cloth, because it says on page 189, in theory, this day celebrates the fact that Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. In reality, this turns out to be a point of some contention. There are some who believe that the Vikings, in particular Leif Erikson, found America first. Still others point out that since there were actually people living here at the time, the folks we now call Native Americans, it was less a matter of discovering than it was a matter of coming and taking over. It's not much of a reason to have a holiday when viewed in this light. So instead of looking at the man or at all the baggage his three little ships carried with them, let's look at the spirit of exploration that is really at the heart of this holiday. You don't have to sail the ocean blue in search of glory and adventure either. Just dedicate this day to some form of exploration, whether that means driving down a road a mile from your house that you just never happened to take before, embarking on a spiritual journey, or even exploring those old boxes your grandmother tucked into the corner of the attic. Allow yourself to take a small leap into the unknown and see what mysteries await you there. After all, a whole new world lies outside your door, if only you take the time and effort to explore it. Now, while I think that this is a worthwhile idea and definitely a way in which you could interpret Columbus Day, which I have to say I'm not familiar with, being a British person, I do think it is kind of missing the point to say, you know, we know that people did already live in America, that even in terms of Europeans discovering it, because I do still think of it as kind of a discovery. Obviously people were already living there, but we didn't know about it on our side of the globe. Even with the fact of his discovery not being so factual and being disputed, I feel like Christopher Columbus still did a lot of terrible things, and without wishing to like go into detail because I didn't really trigger warn for this discussion, a lot of the things to do with colonialism and oppression and terrible things happening to women. So it might be a good way to observe it, to do spells for the protection of people who are oppressed, to do maybe some charitable donations to like women's shelters, people dealing with, you know, the kind of violence that came out of that colonialism. And I realise that's less positive in tone to the rest of the book, which maybe didn't want to delve into these like serious issues, but it did feel weird to me to like still kind of celebrate Columbus Day as a day about exploration and not about, you know, kind of a violent takeover of someone else's property. So that gave me a little bit of a wobble, and it just seemed maybe kind of poorly considered. Similarly, Thanksgiving, it says on page 190, this one is a no-brainer. Take the day to do a ritual of thanks and send out appreciation for all the blessings in your life. And again, that is one interpretation of Thanksgiving. Obviously, historically, Thanksgiving wasn't really about like sharing and caring. It was a lot about murder. So it may be more appropriate to think of it as giving back, again, sort of trying to not necessarily make amends or atonement, because I feel like that's taking it like too negatively, but looking at it as a way to acknowledge that not everything that you have is something that you necessarily got through good means. Sort of like taking the opportunity to sort of confront some of your privilege and maybe work on that. and educate yourself. Obviously not putting a huge magical spin on it, but you can work in gratitude into that as well. I just think that maybe more of an effort could have been made to break down this holiday. And again, like I said, this section was quite American-centric and also looked at things like Halloween and Christmas, which I feel like is cheating because we already have holidays for them. Although obviously a lot of us do celebrate like Christmas and stuff with their families. I do because Christmas is just great. After that, we don't have that many sections left. There's just rites of passage and coming of age and things like that, as well as sort of dealing with things like marriage, getting older, familiars, and there's also some talk about like raising children in paganism and letting them find their own path, which again, not everyone's going to be wanting to have children, but I appreciate that it's in there and it does direct you to some other resources if you're going to need them. And then lastly, we have kind of the shortest section, which is section 6, the natural witch, and it's all about maintaining connection to Mother Earth. There's a little bit of stuff about how gardening can be about therapy and can be made magical, a little bit about living in a city, and that's it. And I feel like, considering we made such a big fuss at the beginning about being connected to nature and that being kind of a core idea behind paganism, that section being last just felt kind of weird to me. It felt kind of a little bit half-hearted, like kind of a tacked on addendum, and not necessarily about a lot of the things that you can do as a witch. For example, like if I'm out and about doing like herb harvesting or going out for a walk because I remember that it's a Sabbath and I'm going to go look at some nature, I'll pick up bits of litter and throw them away, like caring about your environment. Similarly, if I go on the beach and I'm taking like stones or like some of my hagstones that I've collected, I'll pick up litter and take them away as well. You can talk about leaving offerings that are compatible with nature and how service to nature can be part of your Sabbath celebrations, about living a more ecological life, really working some of that, like thinking about how pagan culture and like crystal harvesting and things like that can be supremely unethical and maybe not commensurate with your beliefs as a pagan. I feel like that section could have been really expanded and it just wasn't. Aside from those issues, I do think this is a worthwhile book to get. It's pretty compact. There's a lot of stuff in there just to get you started thinking about ideas. The to read after the sections are quite good. I've earmarked a couple of books from those for purchasing because they did look quite interesting. So I think you could do worse than making this your first book about living a more sort of pagan, witchy life all the time. Just be aware that there is a focus on it, some sort of more from a religious aspect. And there are some places where it does conflate Wicca and witchcraft quite badly. So be aware of that, but I do think there is still a good amount of positive advice in there and you can get a lot out of it. And it's written in this really approachable way. It's not too complicated. There's the occasional joke in there. So I found it quite good, and I don't really usually have a good time reading non-fiction books. I usually struggle quite a bit, but this one went down quite easy, so can recommend. If you've got any other books you'd like me to take a look at, do get in touch via the comments section on YouTube, Twitter, or you can email, which I will check eventually, I promise. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!